If I can please have everyone's attention, I'd like to welcome you to the 4th Community Forum in the selection of the President of Santa Fe Community College. We're getting pretty good at this by now, huh? I'm Todd Lovato, Executive Director of Marketing and Public Relations for the college, and I'm your moderator. In September, the SFCC Governing Board and Presidential Search Advisory Committee invited the SFCC community to participate in 4 listening sessions, as well as an online survey. Academic Search, the search firm selected by the board, led the sessions to gain input from the community. In February, the SFCC Governing Board voted in support of the finalists recommended by the Presidential Search Advisory Committee. These forums give the college campus and community members the opportunity to meet the finalists and to provide feedback to the college's governing board. So before I formally introduce Dr. Rey Rivera, let me just share a brief word on the format of today's forum. We've asked each candidate to prepare an opening 15-minute talk based on the following question. Please help us get to know you better by sharing how you will work to fulfill SFCC's mission to empower students and strengthen our communities. Following the presentation, we'll open up the floor and go into a question and answer session. You can submit your question on a note card at the table at the back of the room, and I will ask as many as possible, or you can raise your hand and Laura will bring a microphone to you. In respect to our limited time together, please keep your questions brief. One last note, your feedback is valuable to the governing board. They appreciate your contribution to this process. There is a survey at the entrance for you to fill out, same place as the cards. After today's forum, please take a moment to fill out the survey, drop it in the comment box on the table. Your feedback is shared with the governing board. Now, please join me in formally welcoming SFCC presidential candidate finalist, Dr. Rey Rivera.
Thank you. Thank you. Welcome to the forum. This is going to give you the opportunity to learn a little bit more about me, but also give me the continuing education that I've been receiving in terms of learning more about your institution. So a little bit about myself, because I've been asked to talk a little bit about how will I work to fulfill Santa Fe's mission, which is to empower students and strengthen communities. And so I'm going to be walking back and forth because I can't stand behind a podium, just back from my teaching days. But to look a little bit about myself, to give you some context, I've been in higher education for 23 years, 15 as a mathematics faculty, and eight years as a administrator, as a dean of career technical education, and then as a vice president of learning for 2 Hispanic serving institutions. So everything that I am as a person, as a leader, has actually been derived from my experiences in the classroom. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my math background. Well, at least a math concept, because it's going to contextualize my response in terms of empowering students and strengthening communities. But there's a branch of mathematics that's called chaos theory, and some of you may have heard of that. But it's the study of dynamical systems where small influences or small changes in initial conditions can have a great impact on the system itself. And one of the most famous examples of chaos theory is the butterfly effect, where a butterfly flapping its wings somewhere in South America can have an influence or even create a hurricane in the Atlantic. Now, I'm not advocating for us to be educational hurricanes when it comes to our student success and retention and how we address the needs of our community. But what I'm going to try to show you is that through this process of having small influences, we can make a great impact in our students' lives. So as far as empowering students, right now I know that Santa Fe is in the process of implementing guided pathways, right? And the idea behind guided pathways is that you want to minimize the courses that are required for students to transfer into the university. So not only do you want to minimize those courses, but you want them to actually apply to their transfer institution, right? That they actually count and not as elective credit. But you also want to maximize interactions, because we know that in addition to having a very specific course sequence and putting them on a path, students will stay in college if they are engaged in the academic arena or in the social arena, for those that know Vince Tinto. They have to be one or the other or both, right? So I think looking at those two ideas and thinking about the student life holistically in terms of how do they begin, right? So from when they start here, when they come to the parking lot, to when they get to their first class, what are all the social interactions that occur between those 2 points, right? Those 2 data points. And not to mention the interactions that occur from the first day of class to completion or graduation. So those are all opportunities that we can have these little mini butterfly effects, right? These impactful instances or situations where we can make meaningful impact on a student long term, okay? So, and then you talk a little bit about on the academic realm, what we can do to encourage students to be successful. And one of the things is that having a positive, validating learning environment. So if you've studied Laura Rendon and validation theory, she says that if students feel welcome, if they feel encouraged, if they feel that they are part of the process, if they're part of their education, they feel empowered, that's where they get the empowerment from, is being part of the academic process. So having those learning environments, so those professional development opportunities for faculty to be as innovative as possible, those are the things you want to do to create those validating learning environments. But to kind of talk a little bit in terms of alignment with guided pathways, there's other things you can consider. One is, what do we do with developmental education, right? So when I was looking at your developmental education model, I noticed that in your reading, or not reading, but in math and English, there's multi-levels of developmental before they can become college ready. So that means that they can take maybe 1 or 2 classes and maybe take up until the third semester to get into a college level class. So if you look at the national trend data, a lot of the colleges and universities, or community colleges, are looking at refining their developmental education programs through multiple measures. Things like a high school GPA. So instead of looking at things solely from an AccuPlacer perspective, right? Actually, a lot of my colleagues in higher education that I know actually call it the InAccuPlacer, because it's not really it's not really clear how students that have just taken college algebra or calculus can place into developmental mathematics, but they can, depending upon how they respond to the AccuPlacer test, right? So how do we utilize things like grade point average to see that if students place into, if they have a GPA of 2.6 or higher, that they get into college level classes semester 1, right? And if they have a 2.6 or below, then they get into college level, but with support. So that's one way of empowering students, is that we want to minimize their time in developmental education or bypass it altogether, right? And so there's a lot of national data in terms of why 2.6 is the cutoff, but that's pretty much one of the avenues in terms of empowering students. Another avenue is experiential learning opportunities. So what are we doing to validate students' career path? Are they getting internship opportunities? Are they getting job opportunities? And I know that you have the program called PILAS, right? Programa de Internos Los Alamos, which is trying to tie those experiential learning opportunities where students get meaningful validation about their career choice. So they know what engineers do, they know what scientists do, they know what artists do. These are all really relevant, and we know that if they have those experiences, the more likely they are going to be successful in their career pathway. So that's just all looking at the academic side of guided pathways. But some examples in terms of the social aspect is those wraparound services that you can create to keep students in the pipeline. Because ultimately you want to minimize the exit points that they have in a guided pathway, right? So that's where the interactions come into play. So things like looking at, making sure that we have an awareness, right? So we serve a very diverse student population, right? The majority of your students, are underrepresented populations, but that's only one element of the spectrum of diversity. There's socioeconomic considerations we have to do. There's students with disabilities, veterans, returning students, LGBTQ. There's many different issues. So what are we doing as a college to, first of all, have awareness that we serve these various populations, right? And then so through the various heritage months and activities, it shows that we have an awareness of the population that we're serving, but then also how do we include these populations in decision making? How do we empower them through that aspect? And I know you have the Center for Diversity and Integrated Learning, right? So how are you creating these cultural relevant pedagogies within your classroom to say that course, that lesson is meaningful to me as a student? So we have to be very student-centered, meet students where they are, but in order to do that, we have to think of the student holistically. Does that mean? I think I'm under the vent. So how do we meet students holistically? Like meet them where they are and do so in a holistic manner. So those are just two ideas in terms of looking at the two elements of Vento's theory in terms of academics and in terms of social interaction to keep students in place. But how do we create those structures? So I'll take a quick little break. Sorry, I've been losing my voice after all the interviews. But how do we create those structures? That's by empowering employees, right? So we want to make sure that that employees feel like they're part of the decision-making process. Because when you think about learning, learning doesn't happen just in the classroom. It doesn't just happen in the laboratory or clinical. It happens everywhere, right? It's permeating through the campus. Every interaction, as I mentioned, is a potential to have a lifetime impact for students. So what are we doing to empower employees that they feel part of the decision-making process, that they feel that we have a culture of innovation where we can innovate, not just for innovation's sake, but so that we can see what are the best practices we can implement to keep our students here. And if we're gonna innovate, then what are our metrics? What are our KPIs? What is our baseline? And how are we moving the needle to do that, right? And if we're successful, how do we find the resources to continue that innovation or scale it, right? Scale it so it serves more students. And if it's not successful, then we have to have the courage to say this is not successful, but what can we learn from that and take away and then go in a different direction, right? Because resources are limited. So these are all just things that I think we can do to, one, empower students is by the various elements that I mentioned earlier in terms of academic, social, but also by empowering employees to help us with the innovative programming to increase student success and retention. And finally, how do we strengthen communities? Well, first and foremost, I think our students are our strongest ambassadors to strengthening our communities, right? Because ultimately their success is going to be our success. So are we in alignment as an institution with the economic development forecast for the region, right? Are we creating the workforce development programs of the future so that our students have a meaningful job once they graduate here, right? Something with a livable wage. These are all things that, for gainful employment, we have to report on for accreditation. But it's meaningful in the sense that we want students to be able to be competitive once they enter the workforce, right? So what are we doing to align ourselves with the economic development forecast of our region? That's one thing. Ultimately, for the students themselves, as I mentioned, they are our strongest ambassadors. So you have many different goals. One is your graduation rate, right? It's at the highest it's been in a while, 23%, which is great for community colleges, right? But my question to you is, what about the other 77%? What are we doing with those students? What kind of data metrics are we collecting to make sure that they're on path? And how do we change our pathways as a result? I think it's imperative that community colleges, we're the next level, we're the social justice engines of higher education, meaning that students that come to community colleges have the greatest upward mobility. We know that as students get an associate degrees or a bachelor's degree, that their economic mobility is increased tremendously, right? So some of the things that you're doing is that you're looking at purposefully targeting high school students, right? You want to have 45% of your incoming high school class to be able to take college level credits. So you're already beginning to think about, okay, how can we strengthen our communities through education? So that's one goal, right? And then another goal that you have is having your 80% of your full-time students and 65% of your part-time students complete the FAFSA. Why is that important? Because ultimately that provides the financial aid, the resources for them to complete their degrees or certificates. Right? So these are all metrics that you're using to see whether or not you're strengthening your communities through education. But how do you know it's working? Right? That's the question. How do we know that these things are working? Well, you've done an economic impact study where you've shown that the wage earning potential of alumni and graduates is about $200 million, right? So $250 million that can impact the local community. So these are all very strong measurements of potential success, right? And then of course you have, so one last thing. So another measure of success is that you recently had your community approval bond, right? So last year, $17 million was dedicated to looking at your fitness center, creating an automotive technology center, and improving technology campus-wide. And according to Todd, when I asked him this question earlier, he said it passed at a 77% approval rate for a bond. Now that's amazing for higher education because most of the time they're not that high. But that just shows that the committee believes in your mission, that you're addressing their needs in terms of workforce, and that they see the potential of why it's so important for the students to be able to, for them to complete their degrees and then ultimately enter the workforce or transfer and then come back and strengthen their communities. So just one little last story I'm going to kind of wrap up with because I really want to get to your questions with regards to the possibility of me being your president. But to go back to think about my lesson, I started off with the chaos theory and the butterfly effect. So I want to give you an example of something that actually hits all various areas. So how am I doing on time? Good, okay. 3 minutes, cool. It's good enough for the story then. So I had a 2 years ago, I was getting ready for Christmas break, and I was looking through my emails, and there was a subject that said thank you. And so I looked at that subject line, and normally as faculty, when I got those messages, it was always encouraging, saying, oh, great, I would get at least 5 to 10 thank you messages from students. But as an administrator, I don't get those thank you messages as much. Right? They have been not as often, not the same frequency. So I opened it up, and it was a student that I had in my calculus class 15 years ago. And she was writing to tell me or thank me for encouraging her to apply for a scholarship. And why was that important? Because in her circle of family and friends, she was the only one that was debt-free in terms of student debt. And if you look at the nationwide statistics, right, student debt is at 1.5 trillion. So that's a pretty big accomplishment on her part to be student debt-free. But she associated a 5-minute conversation that I had with her to have this lifetime impact. So for that 5-minute conversation that I had, which I barely remembered, had a lifetime impact on her. And that's what I mean by butterfly effect. Every single interaction that you have with students can be life-changing, right? Even though you've said the same thing 1,000 times, right? The 1,001st time that you say to that brand new student, that can be the tipping point where they stay or they go. So these are all examples of small interactions, small influences that can have powerful impacts. And so where she is now, where is she now? She's an electrical engineer. She graduated from Arizona State University. And if you know about Latinas and engineering, in terms of baccalaureates, they only comprise about 3% of those students getting baccalaureate degrees. So she's a role model, contributes to a community, is on STEM panels, and does outreach for students that are following her. And that's how she's strengthening the community. So small interactions to empower students will then turn around and strengthen our communities down the road. Okay, so thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Rivera. What are you reading now, or what have you read lately, recreationally, professionally, whatever?
What have I read? This the one?
It sounds like it's...
Okay.
I don't think it's on. Test. There you go.
Okay. Thank you. The question was, what have I read lately, recreationally and professionally?
Yeah, let me just reread it. What are you reading now, or what have you read lately, recreationally, professionally, whatever?
Okay, professionally, the latest book that I've read was Life in the Crucible of Work by Sandy Shugart. So I don't know if any of you know who Sandy Shugart is, but he's the president of Valencia Community College, and they were the inaugural winners of the Aspen Award. And so I think it just provides a perspective from his years of experience as a president in terms of what to encounter when you're entering leadership and when you're most effective and how you should listen and communicate and be transparent and have integrity, all these things that are important for a leader. And so I think that was a really insightful book, mainly because as I'm looking to make this transition from a VP to a president, it's nice to get those perspectives and have them validated from my little cohort of group presidents that I talk to on a consistent basis. And actually, that was given to me by a faculty member, which was, I don't know if they're sending me a message or just, but it was a great book. And then as far as recreational, I think the Book of Joy was a conversation between Desmond Bishop Tutu and the Dalai Lama about your viewpoint in terms of life, in terms of being able to go through adversity, or they gave examples of individuals going through some really severe adversity, but still having this perspective in terms of looking at things in terms of silver linings. And so it just gives you a different, it's kind of the same message that you hear in various venues in terms of just living in the moment and making sure you appreciate the day-to-day. So that was a kind of recreational. And then I'm also, it's not a book thing, but I'm also a sci-fi junkie, and so I love sci-fi, Star Trek, Star Wars, you name it. So I do a lot of Netflix and series watching. So.
Thank you. Why are you interested in leaving your current position to come to Santa Fe Community College, to live in Santa Fe?
That's a good question. Certainly, I think when I was approached to apply for this job, I wasn't really looking to apply for a presidency. I've only applied once, and I was a finalist last year for Palo Alto Community College in San Antonio, my hometown. And so there was a couple of things that when I spoke to the recruiter, she mentioned a couple of things that made Santa Fe very intriguing to learn more about. One was your graduation rate and your retention rates, because that showed a commitment to student success. And for me, that has to be a core, that's one of my core values, is every decision that I make has to be in alignment with student success. And the question is, when we make that decision, is it positively impacting students, right? And then how do we know? So how do we measure that? So the fact that you had these record high retentions and this graduation rate certainly was intriguing. But then I saw all the partnerships you have with Los Alamos and Sandia National Labs, and the fact that your foundation brings in about $1 million of revenue each year, supporting about $100,000 worth of scholarships, showed that you also had the community buy-in, saying that they believed in your mission, they believe in what you're doing. And also the fact that you're a Hispanic serving institution, because I've worked all my life in HSIs, and I felt that I couldn't work in another institution where I wasn't serving that population of students, and mainly because of the various needs and challenges that some of them may have. So to answer your question, why Santa Fe? I mean, it was in alignment with my core values. It was in alignment with my next step in terms of career goals. So I've been a VP for 8 years, or nearly 8 years. And so I just think progressively this is the time for me to make that next step. But I also need to find an institution that aligns with what I value. And so just like you're interviewing me, I'm also learning more about you, and I'm interviewing you as well. Because I want to make sure that we're a good fit. Because ultimately, based on the advice that I've gotten from my colleagues that are presidents, sometimes that can be the turning point, right? If the president's a good fit with an institution or not. So,
thank you. Talk to us about declining enrollment.
Declining enrollment, like nationally, locally. Well, I mean, I understand that. I was mentioning to some of the other groups that I read a recent article that here in Santa Fe, they're looking at the high school populations, and they're noticing a decline in high school enrollment, right? Which, of course, will then down the road impact our enrollment here, right? Because we're going to have a smaller pool to select from, or to try to get to come to Santa Fe. Not to mention you're competing with the universities and things like that. But this is something that is not just specific here to Santa Fe. It's a nationwide trend. In Maricopa, I work at Estrella Mountain, and we're one of 10 of the community colleges in the Maricopa system. We serve about 200,000 students. 9 out of the 10 community colleges are experiencing declining enrollment. Okay, Estrella is the only one that's positive. We've had a positive enrollment for 27 years. But when you look at the data and you unpack it, the majority of our enrollment is because we're retaining our students. So even though we're located in a region that has high growth, we're not getting new students from that growth. We're actually retaining the ones we have. So I think in one way, in terms of declining enrollment, is looking at our retention efforts. And I know you had, your highest retention last year at 85% from fall to spring, but now you're trying to see how can you impact the fall retention, right, to keep them here longer than just a semester. Developmental ed is another way in terms of redesigning developmental ed so that students minimize their time there to kind of increase enrollments. And then I think you also look at the outreach. I think I was talking to Marcos earlier in terms of the tour, and he's a dual enrollment coordinator, and he was telling me how they're trying to do their best to increase their dual enrollments, which of course are opportunities to then transfer those students into coming to Santa Fe. So I think those are all things that are positive for enrollment decline, but ultimately if that's a national trend, then we're going to have to be creative and more entrepreneurial in terms of how we approach keeping our students and also attracting more students. Right?
Thanks. Let me just keep the vague questions going. So what is the biggest challenge for higher education right now?
Jeez. How much time do I have? There's several, but the one thing I was actually talking to the executive team earlier, we were having lunch, and they asked me this question. And from my perspective, it's the perception of the value of higher education. Because if you look at articles and inside higher ed, the New York Times actually did several articles where they're questioning the value of higher education. And the reason why is because they're saying all these students are going through getting their bachelor's degrees and then getting into student debt, right? So that's why we're at the 1.5 trillion. So they're saying, why should students do that? Why can't they just enter the workforce and become entrepreneurial and create these things? So I think higher education, we have to really look at how do we turn that message around? We have the data that shows when students get an associate's degree, when they get a bachelor's degree, it puts them on a different economic path than if they just have high school, right? I think I was looking at your past governor's strategic plan, and about 99.5% of the job growth in New Mexico was going to require an associate degree or a bachelor's degree, right? And so the high school line for it was like kind of flat, but associates a little bit higher, and then bachelor's was really high. So I think we need to show that data. We need to message things differently, and we also need to make a commitment to fund higher education, because ultimately, that student loan debt. That's something that this next generation, they're not going to be able to. And they even say now, if you interview millennials, right, they can't buy a house, they can't get a new car, they can't do the things that other generations, I'm not going to say older, other generations used to do when they got into their workforce. So these are things that we have to kind of message and show, and then provide the resources to students to be more successful, minimizing their debt. Right.
Thanks. I'm going to open up to the floor in just a second. I have one more question. Mary and Nohemi. Just tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Okay. Certainly. So I mentioned a little bit, so I'm from San Antonio. So actually all my family lives in Bexar County, which surrounds San Antonio. I'm the only person that lives outside of that county. My whole entire family lives there, and so I go visit often. So love the So a little bit more about myself in terms of sports. Love the Cowboys, love the Spurs. I'm all Texas, right? But I love the Cubs because I was born in Chicago. But I love to, I CrossFit regularly just because when you're in leadership positions, you have to find ways to kind of have work-life balance. And so I always encourage my direct reports, my deans and my directors, two things in their evaluation is, one, that they have to have professional development opportunities. They have to go to a conference or something to enhance, to just keep current and enhance their skills. But they'll also have to have a well-being goal. So what are they doing to maintain work-life balance? Because that's really important. Because if they're not at 100% when they come to work, then they're not going to be able to serve our students or community at 100%. So I CrossFit regularly 3 times a week if I can. I just ran a half marathon, got my personal best in January. What else? I already told you I like sci-fi, Star Wars, Star Trek. So those are all just things about me in terms of what keeps me going. But really, when it comes to education, it's all about the students. And so, as I mentioned earlier, everything that I learned in terms of being a leader, in terms of collaboration, in terms of working with others to get to a common goal, has all been based in the classroom. In terms of what I did there for my students, in terms of creating those positive, validating learning environments, which translates to creating positive, validating work environments for employees as well.
Thanks a lot. I appreciate that. Mary, you want to?
Okay. Hi, and welcome to our college. My name is Mary Elias, and I'm the Student Involvement Coordinator in the Office of Student Development. So let me see if I can make this question. A couple weeks ago, we went to a conference in Albuquerque, and the keynote speaker was talking about Hispanic serving institutions. And you had alluded to that, you mentioned that a little while ago. So part of the conversation she was mentioning is about being Hispanic serving institution, that you have to meet a certain percentage that we're enrolling them, or we're getting those students. The other part that she talked about is, are we a Hispanic enrollment institution? So as our interim president mentioned at a convocation, right now we're graduating about 3% Hispanic or 3% male minorities. How will you change that or increase that number?
Right. I mean, that's a great valid point. I mean, when HSIs were created, they weren't created like the historically black colleges and universities. It was created at a later time. So, and then they had to come up with some kind of metric to say, okay, you're Hispanic serving now. So the metric of the cutoff is about 25% of the enrollment. But to get to your question about how do we address the equity gaps, I mean, that's part of the access. That's part of the understanding your student population. At Estrella, our equity gaps is not Hispanic males. I mean, actually, our Hispanic students are actually very comparable to our are white counterparts. They're white counterparts. I mean, if you look at retention success, they're almost identical. Where we're having our gaps is with African American males. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to come up with specific programs like bridge programs where they can learn about the college resources in a more intimate setting before they transition to the college itself. When it's full blast fall semester. So I think it's having those kind of specialized programs, and well, first of all, recognizing that you won't have the problem and you're sharing data, so we're aware that we do. But the second is then creating the program and the support structures that are necessary for them to be successful. And so that takes, like I said earlier, innovation, planning, professional development, so that we can get both faculty and staff in alignment to what the initiatives that we're trying to do and accomplish for that population of students. Yes.
Good afternoon, Dr. Rivera. My name is Noemi Bojorquez Flores. I am the student government president here at SFCC. And today I have my team here, my SGA team. My question would be, if elected president, what would be your mission and what would you hope to accomplish in your first year at SFCC?
What would be my mission? Well, first and foremost, the college does have a mission. And it's my personal belief that if we're going to modify that mission, that it has to be organically grown. I can have ideas, right? Or I can have, I think from my discussion, hopefully I've shown a passion for student success and trying to do everything we can to increase our retention and graduation numbers. So anything that I do has to be in alignment with that. If it's not serving students, then why are we doing it, right? So I think, sorry, what was the second part of your question? Mission was the first, and then the second part was? What do you hope to accomplish in your first year? Thank you. First year. Well, I mean, I don't, I've lived all my life in Phoenix. I mean, my adult professional life in Phoenix, so I don't know a lot about Santa Fe other than what I've read on your websites and through the tour today and learned all about your program. So one of my priorities would be, first and foremost, is to meet with all the various groups of the campus, leadership and faculty in various areas, and of course the governing board that's elected, to try to prioritize what are the main priorities that are facing Santa Fe that we have to address immediately. And then can we identify what gaps exist? And you already mentioned one of them earlier, which was the Hispanic males, right? Their graduation and success rates are not equivalent to other groups. So what are the things that we need to prioritize early on? And then, of course, so we're going to have some short-term goals based on those discussions, and then some long-term goals that I would need to work on. But first and foremost is to learn, right? Because if you've taken the strength finders, and I have, one of my top 5 strengths is learner. So I need to learn about things. I'm a mathematician. I need data. So I need to know where things are doing, where we're doing well, where we're not doing as well, and work with those, work with the leadership here at the campus level, and then also with the community, to figure out what can we do in terms of programs, in terms of partnerships that make sense to increase student success and retention, because ultimately that's the focal point of everything that we do. You're welcome. Yes. Oh. Over there first.
Good afternoon, Dr. Rivera.
Good afternoon.
Cedric Page, community member. My question has to do with the board. We do have an elected board here.
Right.
So my question is, how would you work, and what is your philosophy about working with a board to achieve the mission of this college?
Right. So just to give you some context, so you can, hopefully my answer is a little bit more, makes a little more sense. I come from a background, a multi-college district in Maricopa that serves, we have 10 colleges that reports to a chancellor, and that chancellor works directly with the board. That doesn't mean that the board that they somehow don't come to our campuses and we don't interact with them, because we do. But first and foremost, what I would do is, for our board, is to meet with them to determine what are the expectations for me as a president, right? What are the goals that, because they're the elected members of the community, right? And if we're out of alignment with the expectations of the community in terms of our, like I mentioned earlier, our economic forecasts and things like that, and our future workforce development, then what do we need to do to get into alignment, right? So what are the expectations? So meeting with them regularly to determine what those expectations are. And as I mentioned, and then operationalizing those expectations with the faculty and staff of the college. And if those expectations are in alignment with student success and retention, that's awesome, because those are part of my core values, and that's the reason why I'm applying for this position. But ultimately, that's going to be first and foremost, is like I mentioned, it's learning about what those expectations are, not only with the governing board, but with the various groups on campus as well. So I'm going to have to do a lot of learning, a lot of listening, and so I'll probably be wearing my my marathon shoes just so I can get from place to place like I did today.
Welcome, Dr. Rivera. My name is Nick Tejas. I'm the Vice President for Finance here.
Yeah.
And I just was hoping you could talk to us a little bit about any experience you have with developing a budget, mill levies really related to
Right.
revenues and building a institutional budget in an independent community college.
Certainly. Well, so Maricopa gets funding from two different. Well, it used to be three. We used to have a pillar for state funding, but it's been 5 or 6 years since the Maricopa Community College has been state funded. So they've primarily been getting revenue through taxes, through property taxes, and through tuition. So it's our. Although I don't have direct experience in terms of working with our board in terms of that request, we are responsible for providing the data and the rationale behind the request itself. So if we're going to be formulating new programs, new build, or like for example, like this year, each of the colleges were asked to create a growth fund. So we had to do two proposals, a growth proposal, assuming that we're going to get increases with regards to enrollment, or a reduction proposal. So suppose we were going to cut 2% of our budget. So it's 3% growth or 2% reduction. So we actually had to think about, and so what we did as a college, and it was a large portion of basically the academic side, is we had to look through all our program reviews, right, and see what if we were going to grow with 3%, what could we do with that money, right? And so we had to put the rationale behind creating what we're planning to do now, which is a STEM Center of Excellence. We wanted to combine all our resources and leverage opportunities so that we can do outreach to the community to increase that STEM pipeline, but also do in-reach within the college campus to encourage students to pursue STEM pathways. And we've been doing it piecemeal, and it hasn't been as effective as we would like it to be. So that's why we actually want to create a STEM center on the campus that has a faculty director, that has resources, some staff, so that they can coordinate these activities and do so in alignment with all the STEM faculty, really. And also do it in conjunction with our makerspace, because our makerspace, that's a learning environment where a lot of the STEM faculty send their students there for capstone experiences, but we're beginning to realize that it's actually going to be a space that's going to be much more entrepreneurial. So that's part of our STEM Center of Excellence proposal. So we're trying to forecast what we need in terms of college, our local community, right, and include that in our district budget. But that becomes the justification for the tax increases or the tuition increases. In a district, we also have to look at the impact in terms of technology, in terms of the costs of applying these programs. And so all these operational costs, just like as you do, you have to balance the budget, right? So either if you're going to increase costs here, where does that money come from, right? So if it's not going to come from new revenue, then where else can we look at? What other opportunities are available, whether they be grants or whether they become restructuring, right, somehow? But to answer your question, yes, I mean, so we are involved in the process, not directly in terms of asking, but in terms of providing the justification for that request. Yeah.
Hi, my name's Susie Weaver, and I'm a staff member here. I'm because you've been a vice president, I would like to know more about your skills and experience that would make you a president.
Right. Well, I've been a vice president for 8 years, and part of my growth professionally has been to surround myself with mentors that can help me get to the next level. And what I mean by that is the skills and abilities that got me to be allowed me to be successful as a vice president are not necessarily the same skills that are going to be required for a presidency. So I've been trying to expand my skill set. At South Mountain, when I worked, foundations reported directly to me. So we were in charge of fundraising. So we actually created, for example, a $100,000 internal fundraising campaign where faculty and staff, through payroll deduction, contributed $100,000 for student scholarships. So that was one skill set that certainly as a traditional vice president, I probably would have never had except for the reporting structure at South that made it possible, right? At Estrella, I still work with the foundation, but it's not direct. It's not as direct. So my fundraising is more through grant development and things like that. So I think getting those skill sets and knowing what the expectations are. And so every single president that I've talked to that's in my circle of trust, they've all told me the same thing, which is you don't know the position until you're in the position. So even if they can give me this advice, and they're giving me some really great advice, it doesn't necessarily mean that the situation that I enter will be what they experienced. So I think as far as a VP, my personal leadership style is very collaborative. As I mentioned, I need to have data, whether it's input from employees or data from, data sets, things like that. And I've been involved in creating a pretty significant change for the academic divisions of both Estrella and South Mountain through year-long shared governance processes. And actually at South Mountain, we created a shared governance process based on faculty and staff input. So every proposal that's generated at South goes through, can be generated online, and it goes through the operational councils of each major area of the college. So they have an academic council, student affairs council, and administrative services council. So they vet the proposals, and then they go to a shared governance council that does the ultimate vetting and then makes a recommendation to the president. And that's something that happened as a result of a climate survey where faculty felt that the administration, me included, was not very communicative and transparent in terms of how we made decisions. So we decided to create the shared governance process. But like I said, it was very apt for South Mountain at that time. But I'm so grateful because that has given me a different lens in terms of how to work with the culture of an institution to make significant change. And I think at a minimum for being a president, you have to have that ability to be able to identify what the problem is, like where do you want to go, and then what steps you're going to implement along the way, and to get that employee feedback, both faculty and staff, so that we can head in that direction. Because ultimately I'm all about, as I mentioned earlier, about empowering employees. I mean, I can lead initiatives, but the momentum for those initiatives is not going to go very far. It has to be organically grown, and they have to move forward with champions from within the faculty and staff. I mean, that's how things are. That's how our initiatives are, first of all, created and then also maintained. Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Rivera. Before we go to Brian, I have a burning question.
Sure. Burning question.
Red or green? Official state question. That's New Mexico. I didn't make that up.
Okay, so the chilies, right? Well, so. Okay, so you're going to learn a little bit more about me. So when I first moved to Phoenix, the family I was part of, they really believed in having mole for a lot of events, and so when it comes to red chili, that's the first thing that comes to my mind is the sweet taste of mole, which is not something that I really enjoy with meats. So I'm more of a green person. However, when I came here for the initial interviews, one of my colleagues took me to a place in Albuquerque where we had green chili, and they make it way hotter here than they do in Phoenix. So I might have to modify that response down the road.
Thank you, Brian.
Hi, Dr. Rivera.
Yeah.
I'm Brian Duboff. I'm the director of the Small Business Development Center here in Santa Fe. I'm representing the Lead Center, which is also here at SFCC, and another 18 offices across the state, about 65 employees. I'd like to know your experience with the SBDC program, the Small Business Development Center program, and your general philosophy about the role that a community college should play with economic development.
Certainly. I have a very specific example. So when I was vice president at South Mountain, I was approached, I remember his name now. I was talking this example to someone earlier and I forgot the person's name. As a faculty member, his name was Bruce McHenry, and he came to me with this idea that he wanted to create a community entrepreneurial center on the campus, focused on service. And he wanted me to hire an administrator to be the director, which is kind of unique because faculty usually don't ask for more administrators, right? But after listening to his passion and his vision, I realized that it really only made sense if he was a director. So I gave him full reassigned time for a year, And what he did was he utilized that time to form the partnerships necessary for us to create this community entrepreneurial center. So he met with Arizona State University, which has the Ed.D program, and that's a focus on creating small businesses and areas that have low socioeconomic capacity, or that are in low socioeconomic areas. So what they provided was a mentorship. So he created the curriculum, so students would take a series of courses in terms of creating a small business, and then they would be mentored by these small business professionals that were from the South Mountain area, in terms of giving them advice on direction and in terms of their product and things like that. And then for those students that were successful through the program, they did their big pitch, right? And those that won the big pitch qualified for small or low interest loans through Marisol Federal Credit Union, which is one of the partners for the program. So he did a lot within that 1 year. And what was the end result? Within the 2 years of operation, they formed 60 small businesses in the South Mountain community based on service. So they had things like, hair extensions, chocolate, tax preparation, accounting. I mean, all these different things, all these different services. So, we created 60 small businesses, and it'd be nice to follow up. I mean, I unfortunately had to leave right after that and go to Estrella, but it'd be nice to follow up and see how those businesses expanded. So as far as entrepreneurship, it's something that I strongly believe that not only as in creating small businesses is that important, but I think in terms of a mindset for educators, we have to become more entrepreneurial in terms of how we see education, because as I mentioned earlier, I mean, a lot of the resources that are traditional to higher education, tuition and taxes and enrollment, those things are not as strong as they used to be in the past. And I know here in Santa Fe, your state appropriations has gone down by $5 million, if I read that statistic correct. And like I mentioned, in Arizona, we were for the last 5 or 6 years, we were not even state funded. We were just state located. So I think, so go back to your question. Yes, I've had experience working with individuals to enhance small business development in the community. And it's something that I believe is that as far as educational, we have to think about that entrepreneurial mindset for us to be more competitive in the future. So,
Terrence, and then I saw Marcy's hand up.
Welcome, Dr. Rivera. Terrence Donaldson, Human Resources. We are working to become more competitive as it relates to recruiting and retaining talented employees. And one of the ways we're focusing on this is looking at compensation. And to that end, we've commissioned a compensation study. Right. But at the same time, of course, we have to be mindful and fiscally responsible with a focus on evaluating costs and building our reserves. Right. So give us your perspective on creating that balance between recruiting and retaining talented employees and being fiscally responsible.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I had lunch with the executive team and mentioned to them that 2 years ago, Maricopa actually went through a comp and class study where we were trying to figure out how can we be competitive in the market so that when individuals apply to Maricopa, that they're going to be pretty much at the median of the expectation in terms of salary. Well, part of that study was very, it wasn't very transparent on how they got to that conclusion. So what ended up happening is that now new employees that are coming into, like, for example, in the past few years, or even just recently, we've had people that have become vice presidents that only have like a year worth of experience, and they're being placed higher than vice presidents that have been there for a long time. And this is happening at all levels, not just at the vice president, but that's because I know of them because I'm part of that group. So I think it has to, if we're going to look at that equity in terms of forming that equity across the board, first of all, we have to make a determination of what we want to do, what we want to accomplish as an institution. If we want to attract the talent that we think is necessary to move the college in a certain direction, then what is we as a college, as a community, going to support? Because when you do these market studies, it shows you where you are at and where the market is at, and are we going to make that commitment to address that gap if it exists, right? But then what happens to the internal employees? Because inevitably there might be some inversion, meaning that new employees coming in might make more than those employees that have been there for a while. So how do you address those inequities and then do so in a way that's as you mentioned, fiscally responsible? Because ultimately, you can't just automatically say, okay, everybody at this level is automatically going to get a 10% bump, right? I mean, if you're thinking about being fiscally mindful, you can't have that huge increase all in one shot. So how do we do that in terms of perhaps, and I'm just throwing out ideas in terms of performance funding, in terms of is there professional development opportunities that we can create where employees can go through these opportunities and then get increases in pay, things of that nature. I know in Maricopa we have a very vibrant program for professional development where people can take classes, get degrees, get additional degrees to move up the salary scale. Is there any way that we can enhance those type of programs here locally? So I think there's ways to do it that it's not such a huge impact to the institution all at once. But ultimately, the two questions you have to ask is where do you want as an institution be in terms of attracting top talent? And if you're going to do that, then we have to be competitive salary-wise. But then how do you address those inversion issues that happen as a result of being competitive? And then being able to do that at scale so you're fiscally mindful. So yes, it's a tough question, and I know that many systems are dealing with that. There's not really a great one answer that's going to address everything, but I think ultimately, working together as a team in terms of looking at some of the best practices that are utilized maybe from our sister districts or colleges within New Mexico or within the Southwest region is probably a way to go as well.
Marcy.
Hi. Thank you for being with us today. My name is Marcy Iannarino. I am this college's faculty union president, and I am going to ask you about your experience working with unions and how you would work with the union on this campus to form solid relationships. It's a little bit new, the union is.
Right. Well, I'll talk a little bit about my experience first. So I was a faculty member for 15 years, and in that role, I was a two-time faculty senate president. So I was always an advocate for shared governance, even as a faculty senate president, as a division chairperson for science and mathematics. So I'm always attuned to shared governance and shared participation in various issues. Now, as an administrator, as a vice president, I was one of the few VPs district-wide that worked in our meet and confer process. So in Arizona, we're a right-to-work state, so we don't have collective bargaining. And actually what we do is we do a process called meet and confer where the administrators and the faculty kind of meet together and determine what new policy they would like to create to establish the expectations for faculty work conditions. So I was part of that team. I served on there for 2 years, and we would it was usually a year-long process that dealt with interest-based negotiations to come up with a common policy, usually looking at the best interest for students and faculty. And so it's an interesting experience. I mean, I remember the first year that I was there, I was supposed to be an observer, and then because of some movement, I had to be on the team. So it was like learning, drinking water from a fire hose at that point in time. But I think after the second year, once I got my feet, underneath me a little bit, we were able to create some new policy that it's now just being enacted. Like we changed the instructional grievance process in terms of how students can challenge a grade. And because it was very convoluted and students didn't really have representation or really a significant understanding of their due process rights. So we tried to look at the language and we kind of bisected it so that if it's just a grade miscalculation, they go through one process that's expedited because there's usually like financial aid issues or eligibility issues that have to be considered in a timely manner. And then if there's instructional issues, which I'll clarify as things that, not turning assignments in on time or those types of elements, then there's more of a team of faculty and administrators that kind of get together, investigate, and make recommendations. And I think by separating those two issues out, I think it made it a much cleaner process. So it hasn't been enacted yet, but that's just an example of where I was one of the leads in terms of forming new policy with faculty. So I have experience creating new policy, but not specifically with collective bargaining, but within the confines of Arizona, right?
Thank you. I'm going to ask a quick question, then we have a question here. We'll go to Marcos, Ernest, and that's going to be all the time for questions we have today. Dr. Rivera, what is your experience working with continuing education and contract training? How can credit and non-credit programs work together?
Yeah, so at Estrella, where I currently work, we have a really vibrant non-credit program. It brings in, I think right now its budget is has about $250,000 worth of revenue. And so they do everything that you can possibly imagine. They have a community band, they have summer camp for kids, they do all these various things. And what we're trying to do is trying to see what can we do to utilize those non-credit opportunities and transition them to credit opportunities. I think that's the magic question for lots of institutions. Estrella used to have what we call the Southwest Skill Center, which was a lot of non-credit training. So things like medical assisting, phlebotomy, those are all things that we were offering. It's now moved to another college, but it's still on our campus. But what we were doing is we were trying to create these transitional bridges from the non-credit programs to the credit programs in areas that made sense. So like medical assisting, there might be students that want to pursue the nursing pathway, right? So how do we recognize those credits those credits from a non-credit side to a credit side so that they don't lose momentum in terms of pursuing a nursing degree. So I think these are all opportunities that that we can take on as an institution in terms of what makes the most sense, because I don't know for the summer kids camp if we can convert those to credits. I don't think that would make sense in that avenue, but maybe down the road, right, once they come college age. But I think just getting that opportunity to have students on our campus, whether it's kids college or whether you name it, just getting them on campus, I think in itself can help with transferring things from a non-credit to a credit side.
Okay, gentleman in the red cap.
Bill Garrett, perennial student, retired civil rights lawyer from Texas, did a lot of work with Southwest Voter Registration Education Project in San Antonio. I was glad to hear you mention the necessity of the remedial education that we offer here. And when you look at the catalog, it's something like addition and subtraction and, parts of speech. And other than offering these remedial programs, which are a necessity because of our dismal, secondary educational system, is there any other avenue that the community college can play in order to try to remedy this dismal situation?
Yeah, I think developmental education, remedial education has been sort of on the forefront of the national education discussion for a while, because we know that students don't come to Santa Fe or any community college to major in developmental education. They just don't. And when they get there, it can be one of the gatekeepers for preventing them being successful. So that's why early on in my presentation, I was advocating that we actually look at ways that we can get students to be college ready, or enter college level classes in their first semester. And so if you look at multiple measures, because right now what happens is that students take a placement exam, and that placement exam tells them, even though you've taken college algebra or calculus in high school, you might have to start developmental level because after 5 hours of being at the college, you took an assessment test and you didn't know the ramifications of taking that test, right? And that's why I kind of joke that AccuPlacer is really an AccuPlacer, because it all depends upon how they answer those questions. So I'm a really strong advocate in terms of minimizing time in developmental education for those students that make the most sense, right, in terms of GPA requirements. But for those students that need developmental education, what support services do we have in place? So if they're taking a college level class with support, what does that support look like? And is it based on best practices? Do we know we're making a difference? I know some institutions have also moved to a non-credit model for basic education. That can be a little bit tricky because we're going back to that question of how do you convert non-credit to credit. And once again, there might be other pathways for those students that are having difficulty with remediation. And I think that's why we have things like career pathways and other things that we can utilize that may make a lot of sense. And I'll give you an example. Like there was a student, there's a student of mine that he goes to Estrella probably every semester, and he's working on, I believe, in his third associates, and mainly because he doesn't have the math background to transfer to university. Now in his mind he's successful because he's getting associate degrees, but at some point, before we transitioned into more of a pathways model, he was just taking math class after math class after math class. I don't know how many times he took our developmental 092 class, and it wasn't successful passing it. So what does that say about us as an institution if we're allowing those types of situations to happen, and if we're not doing our best to think about other alternatives for those students that have those types of difficulties? So.
Okay, we've got about 2 minutes left, so let's see how far we can get.
Good afternoon, Dr. Rivera, and thank you for your time. I know we're a little pressed for time, so I'm going to kind of rush.
Okay.
In your own terms and opinion, if you will, define equity versus equality and how you plan on implementing them in our community and here on campus.
Right. When I think about equity and equality, I don't know if many of you seen that slide where, you know, equality means that we all have access, right? Equity means that yes, we may all have access. So I think the slide is like, you know, you have these individuals sitting on crates looking at a baseball game, and they're all given different size crates. So one individual can see the game and the other one can't see the game because it's not high enough. So that's equality, right? They're all given a stand, but it's not equitable because they don't all have the same view. So I think when it's coming to acknowledging equity is looking at our data, looking at and seeing which populations are not getting the same retention and success rates as other populations. And then what do we do to create innovative programming or base it on best practices that are helping those students and get them to where they need to be in terms of success and retention.
Dr. Rivera, Marcos Maes, Director of Recruitment and Credit, Santa Fe Community College.
Marcos?
So I think it's very crucial and important that our college leadership is relatable to in particular to our first generation college students that are on this campus.
Right.
So if you had a room filled with first generation prospective college students,
right,
what would be a story you would share regarding a barrier that you faced to get to where you are today?
I would have a lot in common with that student population because I'm a first-generation student myself, first in my family to graduate from college, you know, grew up in poverty, single-family household. I mean, basically every single demographic that was probably a negative I encountered at some point in time. So I think I think that's the reason why I associate with HSIs, is that I see those students, I see a reflection of myself in those students. And so anything that I can do, any kind of advice I can give them, I would more than share. And to show them that regardless of the obstacle, there's always a pathway to success. So, and that's just a mathematician in me. I just can't, there's always a solution. It may not be the easiest solution, but there's always a solution.
So let's show our appreciation to Dr. Rey Rivera. Thank you.